And Miko Peled, for those who don't know, your grandfather Miko was foundational to the founding of Israel. He signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and then his son, your father,
His not my son, his son-in-law.
his son-in-law, your
Yeah,
father,
yeah.
was an Israeli general.
Yes.
And you have the apples fallen far from the tree. So you are very vocally critical, to put it nicely, against Israel. So how did that happen? How does a guy with a grandfather who was part of the founding process of Israel and whose father was a Israeli general, how did you develop the viewpoints that you have?
Maybe by simply waking up to the lies, the untold truths, and storming through the false narratives? Welcome back, everybody. My name's Z. Today we have Miko Peled, a human rights activist whose life story is so fascinating it could bring a Netflix series. Picture this: his grandfather helped establish the state of Israel. His father was a decorated Israeli general, and here he is, unapologetically dismantling the Zionist narrative like it's IKEA furniture without the manual. And then there's Jake Newfield, a staunch defender of Israel's policy, who probably has more rebuttals than there are Starbucks in Tel Aviv. Jake's here to ensure we see all sides of the story, even if those sides occasionally sound like they were cribbed from a government press release. Grab your popcorn and your critical thinking caps. It's about to get real. Let's jump in.
Well, the short answer is that's why there's a book called The General's Son. And so the book tells a story. But the shorter answer is that, I mean, it was, there's a progression.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, my grandparents were Zionists. They came to Palestine to colonize. They established a state. My father was a young both my parents were born in Palestine when it was still called Palestine. And then my father joined the militia, the Zionist militia, then became an officer and remained in the military. And then he retired as a general in 1968, so after the 1967 war. And if anybody knows, his name was Miko Peled, so if anybody knows anything about, you know, how things evolved on the more kind of the lefty side of the Zionist state, he, right at the end, the very last day of the 1967 war, he stood up and said, "We now need to make peace with the Palestinians." And that was shocking to everybody. I mean, first of all, nobody said that word. They were Arabs, and why do we need to do anything with them other than get rid of them? But he dedicated the rest of his life to this notion of a two-state solution, what we know today is a two-state solution. And he said we can give them a small state in the West Bank and Gaza and move on and live in peace and so on. Of course, from that moment on, he was considered an outsider and a traitor. And the rest, the Zionist establishment did everything they could to settle the West Bank, to destroy, you know, to continue the destruction of Palestine and the displacement of Palestinians. And so when you say, I'll just finish, when you say I fell far from the tree, I did fall far from the tree, but there was an intermediate moment there in my life where there was some discussion about Palestinians, about Palestine. So I had a bit of a head start. I just took it, you know, further than that because he was a Zionist and he believed in the Zionist ideology and the idea of a Jewish state, and I reject that.
And you advocate for Palestinians a lot because you really care about them getting their rights and what's best for them. Let's talk about that first.
But that's not completely accurate. I think that the solution, I think that a peaceful resolution of the question of Palestine, which I believe is inevitably going to be a single democracy with equal rights, will benefit Israelis as well. Israelis will be living much better than they are today in a peaceful, free, democratic state. So this is going to benefit everybody who lives, you know, between the river and the sea, not only Palestinians.
And right, ultimately you care about both people.
Yeah.
You're not saying let's wipe out,
no, God forbid,
kill Israel and just get rid of it. So, you know, I mentioned I spoke to Ilan Pappé and Gideon Levy and other people who have totally opposing views to them. And one thing that I've learned, or that I think is true about this conflict, is that you do have, I know that your view is that Israel is by far the aggressor here, and they are the primary ones responsible for suffering. That being said, I don't know if you'd agree with me that you still have people on the like pro-Palestine side who are anti-Semitic, right? Like that does exist, and there are people who do go too far in calling for Jews to be killed, right? I mean, just like with any movement, even if we think the Palestinian movement is the right movement, there are going to be people in any group who are evil. Is that fair?
Well, I think it's irrelevant one way or the other. I mean, whether they exist,
Yeah.
I never met anyone who speaks that way, and I've met a lot of Palestinians over the years. But I think it's irrelevant. I think basically we're talking about an apartheid regime that has been terrorizing the Palestinian people, a regime that was been put in place by settlers, by colonizers, who then became and then stole the country, renamed it, called it Israel, and has been on an ongoing engaged in an ongoing project of not only establishing an apartheid state but getting rid of the Palestinian people in whichever way they can. So there's no symmetry here at all. Whether they're good people or bad people on either side, it's completely irrelevant. That's not the point here.
I want to work through your condemnations of Israel and concede to every point I can. I mean, I didn't bring you here to try to upset you or anything.
Yeah,
But I do think it's important to dive into these things.
Sure.
Because people see things very differently, and I guess one thing I want to point out is, and we'll get to Israel, but when people are angry at Hamas and they say, look what Hamas has done, and of course you're probably thinking like, hey, the Hamas is only a small part of this picture. You're probably thinking the real thing going on here is Israel's oppressing them, and I don't even want to take a stance on that. I'm not disagreeing or agreeing that Israel is or isn't the oppressor or the aggressor. The point I want to make right now is that we can condemn Israel all day, but that doesn't. We're not contradicting ourselves if we also say, hey, you know what? Yes, the Palestinian people should be free. Yes, they're being oppressed. The blockade's terrible. Everything you said, let's just say I grant everything to be true. I can still sit here and say, well, you know what? If I was in charge of the Palestinian people, I'd be really upset with like October 7th because
Why?
I'll tell you why. Because they went after a lot of civilians, and that's not a good strategy. Like if I'm in charge of Palestine, Gaza, and my goal is for the liberation.
But that's not accurate. That's not true. The majority of the Israelis that were killed by Israeli fire.
What I read, I read Amnesty Report and Human Rights Watch, and those two are those reputable sources? I guess my first question.
Yeah, they are reputable.
So Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and I can send you these articles probably after this. Both, I mean, sorry, you don't need that. I'm sure you've read them. Have both shown that 1,200-ish civilians were killed, majority by Hamas. There were some killed by the IDF, but
it's not accurate.
Why is there always a but from Jake? It seems like you've got a knack for dancing around the obvious with that polished, both sides rhetoric. It's admiring in a way, almost like watching someone try to justify putting pineapple on a pizza. Sure, technically correct that every movement has their extremists, but isn't that just a covenant detour to avoid addressing a systematic problem or an oppression? Let's be clear, Miko's call for a single democratic state isn't just idealistic. It's the only path forward, and if that makes Israel uncomfortable, maybe it's time for some deep introspection rather than more deflection.
But then so is it that we don't believe Amnesty and
it's not
Human
that
Rights
it's
Watch?
just that number one, again, it's a detail that may or may not be relevant to the larger picture, but the narrative that claims that Palestinians murdered over 1,000 Israelis has been refuted by very reputable sources. Electronic Intifada just came out with another report just recently, using predominantly Israeli sources, speaking to Israeli commanders, talking about the Hannibal.
That was real. That happened. The Hannibal initiative, whatever it was. Yeah, that happened.
And more people now. Again, the majority. What is absolutely clear is that the majority of the people Israelis that were killed by Israeli fire, whether it was a mistake, whether it was a directive, whether it was this, whether it was that. The objective of the Palestinians who came out of the Gaza Strip was to take the military base and to take as many hostages as possible, so they could in order to have a prisoner swap. That was the objective. To go ahead then and kill civilians right, left, and center makes no sense. It was not the objective.
We agree it makes no sense, right? We agree it wouldn't make. In other words, you and I agree that it would.
And I don't believe they did.
Wouldn't. Well, wouldn't. I guess we're at least in agreement that it wouldn't benefit the Palestinian people for there to be a civilian targeted attack. Because that's not going to. So I guess my question is, what am I missing? Because help me out. You know more on this stuff than I do. I'm looking at Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. They're telling me one thing. What do I do?
Well, I think part of the problem is that it took a very long time before anybody could actually get in and investigate this. So this is taking a very long time. More and more information is becoming available as time goes on. More and more Israeli sources are beginning to talk about what actually took place. So I think it's going to be a while before we actually have all the details in place. and before somebody gets in there and does this independently. But from what I know, and I'll say this again, from what I know, the vast majority of the Israelis killed were killed by Israeli fire, by Israeli forces. I know that happened in Be'eri. I know that happened with helicopters that were shooting people as they were running one way and another. But again, I think we're focusing on the wrong issue here. I think the point is the larger issue here, and it's not that human life is not important. It's very important. Every life is sacred, and we don't want anybody to die. At the same time, we have to remember there's a concentration camp with over 2 million people, bordering all these Israeli kibbutzim and settlements where people are living. People are enjoying a very high standard of living and so on. I had family members in kibbutz Be'eri. I had family members in kibbutz Zikim, which are just, kibbutz Be'eri, of course, was hit very hard. The larger picture here is, in my opinion, that number one, no attention has been given by these people who enjoy this very high standard of living and wonderful life on these kibbutzim and in these settlements in that part of the country. No thought was ever given to the fact that 2 million people are living in a concentration camp 3 kilometers away from them, or even less. So I think that's the first thing we need to take into consideration. When we talk envision anyone living a normal life outside of Nazi concentration camps and the differences between one and the other, and to think that people were living a regular life while these horrific things were happening to Jews and didn't care, that is shocking, as it should be. And this is the same thing. They didn't care about what was happening
I thought those specific communities actually specifically did care.
They did not care. If they cared, they would have done something. I used to go to kibbutz Be'eri growing up every summer and every holiday. I had relatives there. Nobody ever talked about the fact that there's a concentration camp there. The fact that they voted slightly more left to center during the elections is completely irrelevant. By and large, Zionists and the Zionist mainstream cared nothing about this.
And I hear what you're saying to me, Jake. Don't focus on the wrong point. It's not about. It's about the bigger picture that Israel's oppressing, and I'm not trying to refute that. The reason we're here and the reason I think these conversations are so important is because I think that people in general are good. Everyone wants the same things, and when you see half of people on the pro-Israel side and half on the pro-Palestine side, it's not because the values are different. In my view, it's because their understanding of events is different, and so. I do want to keep.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
During Jim Crow, would you say that about the whites in the South?
No.
During apartheid in South Africa, would you say that about the whites in South Africa?
No.
The Afrikaners?
No.
During World War II, would you say that about the Germans?
No.
Okay, so there's no difference here. Well, I don't know why these people get a pass. Why do Israelis get a pass?
Bullseye, Miko. You just dismantled one of the most infuriating double standards of our time. Jake's attempt to romanticize the good intentions of the oppressors crumbles when confronted with history. Would anyone excuse the whites during Jim Crow, the Afrikaners during apartheid, or the Germans during World War II as simply misunderstanding the events? Absolutely not. Miko's response is a masterclass in calling out nonsense. Why do Israels get a pass? Mic drop. Jake's left fumbling for words while the crowd is cheering Miko on. Let's face it, if ignoring oppression were an Olympic sport, some folks would be on the podium polishing their gold medals. But not today, Jake. Not today.
Yes, let's work. But I say this to say that I hope you let me entertain another few minutes about Hamas. And I hope you don't take these questions and what I'm saying to be dismissive or to try to use kind of a red herring to get away from the real issues.
Well, why are you asking so much about Hamas? Why is it so important to you?
Well,
what is it that we're trying
to
get to?
I want to get your permission to ask about them so that you don't ask questions like that.
Of course, go ahead.
Because the why is, for all the reasons I just said, is because I think that
I'm not a spokesperson for Palestinians or for Hamas. I can tell you what I think and what I believe.
Well, but here's the why, is because I think it's important to get to specific issues, because my belief is not, I don't think this issue is that analogous to the Jim Crow era or to the Nazi era. I think that there's legitimate disagreements and misunderstandings people have, and I want to be able to talk about a point and us to have an you need to take me at my word that I'm being good faith here, that I'm being sincere in my questions, and I have a genuine curiosity. So my question is, the Amnesty International report and Human Rights Watch both showed that the majority of civilians killed were by Hamas. What should I do with that information? Do I disregard it? Are they lying to me? Is it a conspiracy?
I don't think they're lying. I think based on information they gathered at the time that they gathered, that's probably the information that they had.
And is it true? Is it false?
But I think it's short of the truth. I think, and again, there's a report that just came out on electronic intifada that demonstrates that The vast majority of the Israelis that were killed on that day or during that time were killed by Israeli fire. And again, like I said, they've got Israeli
where did it
sources
show
and so
that?
on.
Where did it show that? Where was that?
Electronic Intifada.
Is that? I mean, come on, but that
Electronic Intifada is probably the most reliable news source on Palestine that there is. And I'm not arguing with what Amnesty
the title
says.
is Electronic Intifada. How could
Yes.
that be? That's not an unbiased source.
It is an unbiased source.
Do you think so?
I know them and I know it, of course.
Do you
I
think the
don't so, I know
Electronic
so.
Intifada takes seriously the Israeli viewpoint because their name is
Absolutely.
Electronic Intifada?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to start a
It's-
newspaper.
it's a reliable-
called,
it's a-
I have a
it's a-
newspaper. It's called the Nakba.
Okay.
I mean, these are terms that are heated terms that are used
It
to.
doesn't matter. As a resource, look, I don't want to, again, we're arguing about the
Yeah.
Electronic Intifada. I'm just telling you, it's a reliable news source. If you don't want to believe me, don't believe me. But it is a reliable news source, and they say differently. But the point is, again, we're focusing on what happened and who killed who and how many. The bottom line is, when you have millions of people living in a concentration camp, when you have millions of people subjected to apartheid, when you got millions of people who are living a life of terror, where children are being killed, people don't have access to water.
Yeah.
And we're talking about a place where that, 5-minute drive out of the Gaza Strip, concentration camp, Israelis are living, drinking water, having electricity, there's no problem. 5 minutes away. And the only reason that concentration camp exists is because the Israelis, regardless of where they live, are allowing it to continue. They were allowing it to continue. They were allowing it, and they were enforcing it, and they were voting for governments who continued to enforce it and maintain a concentration camp full of Palestinian civilians right there on the southern coast of the country. That is reprehensible.
Yeah.
So whether Palestinians came out and killed this many or that many Israelis,
Yeah.
it may be sad, but it is not relevant to the larger picture. The
I-
larger picture here, that I'll say it again,
Yeah.
millions of Palestinians living in a concentration camp guarded by Israelis, maintained by Israel, put in place by Israel. And there's no conversation about why are we not dismantling this? Why are we not liberating these people, just like Jews were liberated from concentration camps after World War II? That needs to be the conversation.
So let's talk about that. Let me move to the next point.
Sure.
I want to ask you about, and then I'll come back to that because the final thing I'd say about Hamas, and I think when I talk about Hamas, you don't love what I'm saying, and I think it's because you're saying, Jake, why are you focusing on Hamas?
No, you're focusing on a particular day of a particular event,
and you're saying, Jake, there's a bigger picture. But let me tell why.
The facts
But
are
let me
perhaps
say
not so
one.
clear,
Let me say
not yet clear.
Let me say one more thing about why I think it is important, not just to feel sympathy for Israelis, but for Palestinians. If I'm a Palestinian living in Gaza, what I want is a government who's going to stand up for me. And when Hamas, I guess what I'm asking you is, can we both just agree that, like, in a perfect utopian world, there'd be a government in Gaza who treats people better than Hamas?
No. In a perfect world, there will be no Gaza Strip. People in Palestine will be free to live, to go back to their homes, to go back to their lands, to enjoy the water and the wealth and all the resources that exist to other people who live between the river and the sea. That would be happening in the perfect world. What it doesn't matter who is the warden in this particular, who is running this particular concentration camp.
Why doesn't
It happens to be Palestinians. It happens to be Palestinians who were voted in. It doesn't matter. Hamas may be the party that's in place right now. But there's many reasons for that. Hamas is a resistance organization that would never have been established had there not been the oppression, the ethnic cleansing, the apartheid. Had all these crimes by Israel not been committed, Palestinians would not have had to establish another resistance organization.
Yeah,
So it's a resistance to oppression.
There's a cause and effect. But let's say I hate Trump, and let's say I don't like Donald Trump. I'm not a big fan. If you say to me, but Jake, Donald Trump is just a result of this and this and this, and that could all be true. And I could say, yeah, but I still don't like Donald Trump.
It's not the same analogy.
It's not, but I'm saying, like,
we're talking about a people who have been subjected to a genocide. You're missing the point here. There's been a genocide. If you look at right now, open up the definition of the crime of genocide, compare that to what has been happening to Palestinians since 1948, you will see it checks almost every box. It is genocide. Apartheid is the same. Ethnic cleansing is the same. These three crimes have been perpetrated against the Palestinians for almost 8 decades. And you're asking me about a particular resistance organization and whether we like them or we don't like them. That's not the point. They're a resistance organization. They do what they believe is the right thing for their people. And had it not been for the oppression, for the concentration camps, and on and on and on imposed by Israel, none of this would have happened. The entire last year could have been spared. Nobody could have been, all the people that died in the last year could have been alive today, and they could have been living well had it not been for the existence of this concentration camp, the existence of the apartheid state, and the continuation of the genocide, which is being paid for and by the United States and armed by the United States.
This exchange captures the core tension in debates about Palestine and Israel around the world, focusing on systems versus addressing root causes. Jake's fixation on Hamas is like critiquing the customer service at a burning building while ignoring the fire itself. Miko's response flips the script, framing Gaza as a product of systematic oppression, not just governance. His analogy about a warden running a concentration camp is brutal yet piercing. Whether it's Hamas or anyone else, the larger issue is that existence of the camp itself. Jake's attempts to compare Hamas to Trump is like bringing a butter knife to a sword fight. Miko's rebuttal, connecting decades of genocide, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing, swings the discussion back to the core issue, the systematic dehumanization of Palestine since 1948. The back and forth shows the power imbalance and how systematic injustice are often overshadowed by debates about resistant tactics. If you made it this far, leave a comment down below as to what you thought about this debate between Miko and Jake. Like, share, and subscribe as well, I ask kindly. Stay tuned because understanding the roots of resistance is the first step towards real dialogue and maybe, just maybe, one day bring justice to the oppressors.